Hello everyone, my name is Andrew Wood with ASI. Thank you very much for taking the time to come out here today. Today what I'm going to be talking about is CGMPs and how they're applicable to the cannabis industry. So let's begin with what are GMPs. First of all, the C means current, and then GMP is good manufacturing practices. What it does is that they outline the conditions and practices the industry must follow for producing safe products. So think about it, you have a clean facility, you're following everything you must do, pretty much GMP. There's a lot more to that, we'll go into the layers here in a bit, but that's just a general rundown. So whenever you're talking about GMPs, there's different levels and different requirements based on the product. So say if you're doing pharmaceuticals, it's going to be 21 CFR 211. If you're doing dietary supplements, so your protein powders, nutraceuticals, things along those lines, that's going to be 21 CFR 111. And then food and beverages, what was formerly 21 CFR Part 110 is now 117 because of FSMA, and we're going to be focusing on Subpart B. So here's one of the reasons we're going to focus on it. Federal legalization is going to come later down the road. So the thing is, you want to be prepared now and you don't want to be reactive in this situation. Being proactive is definitely beneficial. So now let's talk about 21 CFR 117 Subpart B. Alright, so there are applicable sections under this. So think of this as your requirements or categories. So this isn't going to include your personnel, so your employees, plants and grounds, so how clean your facility is and the surrounding areas, sanitary operations, sanitary facilities and controls, equipment and utensils, so how do you control those pieces in your facility, processes and controls, warehouse and distribution, so how do you store this product and how is it going to move through the supply chain, and then defect action levels. All right, let's talk about the personnel, so your employees. So number one, especially in today's world, you need disease reporting to ensure sick employees are not working with products. There are many different reasons to this. You don't want, say, your product contaminated. You don't want your entire staff to be sick, and then you can't even produce anything. So number one, you need disease reporting. You need to ensure that if somebody's sick, you take the appropriate measures so they don't come in and infect the rest of your staff, or like I said, the product. So let's talk about your personnel. What do they need to do? Number one, wearing appropriate clothing. One question that was brought up in a previous conversation was, hey, what if I have a home grower that grows, he has a bug infestation, and then he comes into the facility? One way to mitigate that is wearing appropriate clothing, and also on top of that, you may want to have a change of outfits whenever you come into the facility. You also want to make sure that there is adequate personnel cleanliness. Maybe dreads aren't the best thing in a cultivation facility. Also, you want to make sure you're washing your hands thoroughly at an appropriate frequency. So, if you say run into any contamination points, wash your hands. Make sure you're not bringing that into the facility. Also, remove all unsecured jewelry and other loose objects. Say you're in the edibles kitchen, you have jewelry on, you're producing something, and a stone falls into a product. That could be a quick lawsuit, and you want to avoid that at all costs. Maintaining gloves and changing them as needed, that's important for both the facility and the employee themselves. I'm sure your employees don't want sticky hands from all the terpenes, so win-win situation on that one. Also, you want to wear appropriate hair and beard nets. Now, here's the thing. We all know the cannabis plant is very sticky. If you are near cannabis plants, you lose a piece of hair, that is very prone to going on the plant. So I highly recommend beard coverings, hair nets, and so on. So that's a little bit about the personnel. Let's talk about the plants and grounds now. So this is another very important thing. So the ground under the facility's control must be in a condition that will protect against the contamination of products, including properly storing the equipment. So make sure that your equipment is stored in a safe and clean manner. Removing litter and waste. You don't want litter and waste to just sit on the floor or in an area that it's not meant to be in. Cutting vegetation within the, say, around the vicinity of the plant. Now this is very important too, because you're going to work so hard to, say, keep every single insect out of your plant. So the last thing you want is plants around your building. That is a good area for these insects to hide and then eventually get into your facility. So make sure that you do not have vegetation around your building. Also, maintain all roads, yards, and parking lots. Now this is one that usually comes, that people question. For example, the parking lot. Why do I need to maintain that? Well, the thing is, say if you have a big dip in your parking lot, you have standing water in that dip, that can be a contamination point, and then an employee can walk through that standing water and bring that contamination point into your facility. So that's no bueno. Also, you want to ensure you have adequate drainage. So say in your cultivation room, if you're, say, prone to getting water on the floor, you need to make sure that water has a place to go. So continuing on the plant and grounds, the plant must be suitable in size, construction, and design to facilitate maintenance, sanitary operations, and for production purposes. The plant must have adequate space for the equipment and storage materials. So if you're in a cultivation room and you have sliding benches, make sure you have enough room in between each of the benches. And if you have your equipment on the wall hanging, make sure that it is not close to those plants. Also, you want to make sure the floors, walls, and ceiling are adequately clean and in good repair. So this is key because a lot of times whenever you're in a cannabis cultivation facility in the food processing area, these are going to be sealed rooms with not much ventilation, and you're not going to have an air exchange as far as the inside to the outside. So you want to make sure that you have all these surfaces constructed in a way that it's easily cleanable, because you want to get rid of all of those, say, molds, pathogens, and everything else between each runs. And then in the processing area, say if you're making edibles, you want to be sure that all the food contact surfaces are cleanable as well. So let's go on to ensure drip or condensation from fixtures, ducts, and pipes does not contaminate products. One thing that I want to toss out here too that a lot of people overlook are dehumidifiers. The drain lines and dehumidifiers are typically disgusting, so do not ignore that either, because that is one common area that people don't look into. You also want to provide adequate lighting. I'm sure that's not going to be a problem in cultivation rooms, but just make sure in your edible processing rooms that you do have proper lighting so everybody can see what's going on. You want to provide adequate ventilation. So one example I can think of is, say you're pressing pills in the edibles room and there's a lot of powder, dust, and things along those lines. You want to mitigate that dust from pressing those pills. You also want to provide adequate screening for protection against pets. Pests. In the cultivation room, be sure that you get out, say, some lenses to look at the plants in close detail, and always be sure you don't have any detrimental pests in there. Now let's talk about sanitary operations. What can you do to keep your facility clean? So let's talk about the building fixtures and physical conditions. So they must be cleaned and in a sanitary condition to keep it in, say, good standing. So, and another thing is you're cleaning compounds and sanitizing agents. You want to make sure you have a chemical control policy. You want to make sure these sanitizers and cleaning products are stored away and that they are always at the right strength to utilize them to their fullest capacity. So you don't want, say, an over-diluted sanitizer where it's not even going to be effective. Another thing I want to talk about is single-service articles. So if you have anything like paper towels, paper cups, things along those lines, you want to make sure that these are stored away from other materials within your facility. And then you want to make sure you have a place you could easily dispose of these products so you don't run into any contamination points. A lot of times what I see companies do when they, say, offer paper cups to their employees, maybe they'll give them a cone cup. The reason behind that is with a cone paper cup, you can't put it on a surface and just let it sit there. You have to drink it and then throw it away. So pretty good right there. Now let's talk about non-product contact surfaces of equipment. Used in the operation of the plant must be cleaned in a manner and as frequently as necessary to protect against allergen, cross-contact, and against contamination of the product. So really you just want to make sure the facility as a whole is as clean as you can get it, and you want to do sampling to ensure that your cleaning methodologies are appropriate. Let's talk about some other stuff now. So this is mostly going to be on water, plumbing, and drainage. So number one, the water supply must be adequate for the operations intended. It must be derived from an adequate source. So I know this was a hot topic earlier, just always make sure you do water testing. Make sure that the number one input you're putting into this plant isn't contaminated itself, because that could run into some issues later down the road. Now, your running water, it needs to be at a suitable temperature, and it needs to be under pressure as needed. So you want to make sure that the lines have plenty of pressure so you can get an adequate water supply to there. And then that's really just going to help you with the cleaning of equipment, utensils, and things along those lines. Now, the plumbing. You must be adequately sized for the facility. There's lots of water running through a cannabis cultivation facility. From the reservoirs in the irrigation room, to the dehumidifier drains, just to the standard plumbing, to all, say, sanitary facilities. You want to make sure that this is at the appropriate capacity. And also you want to be sure that you're properly, avoiding any contamination within these points. So you want to make sure all your lines are clean, and definitely do some water testing here and there. Next, I talked about this a little earlier, it's floor drainage. So you want to be sure you don't have any standing water on the floors, because that could be a huge contamination point at the end of the day. This is a hot topic that really isn't talked about in the, cannabis industry, but it's very relevant in the food industry, becoming more relevant in the cannabis, and it's backflow preventions. So you want to be sure that, if you have any drainage water or anything else, you're not going to contaminate your water source, and be sure that you have any, tools out there to mitigate the risk. So sewage must be disposed in an adequate sewage system. So an inadequate sewage system would be maybe putting 5-gallon buckets underneath your grow trays and dumping them outside. Don't do that. Make sure everything is plumbed and you're good to go. Also, I spoke about this in the past, but let's go over it again. Provide adequate hand washing facilities. One thing I always like to toss out there too is if you're ever changing your gloves, you should probably wash your hands too during that process. That's a good time to do so. Now let's transition to equipment and utensils. So equipment and utensils must be designed so they can be adequately cleaned. So equipment and utensils won't go that far if you can't clean it. For example, one thing I try to tell people to stay away from is anything that involves wood in your cultivation or your processing room. Reason being is that wood is a porous surface, and at the end of the day, that's not really a cleanable surface or, equipment. So try to avoid any type of wood or anything like that. And you also want to be sure that your equipment doesn't, have any lubricants or metal fragments that could be a risk of cross-contamination with your product itself. Now let's just go on to the equipment. The equipment must be maintained and in good repair. So if you notice any equipment cracking or anything like that, that could pose a product risk. If you have, a Hobart mixer mixing some batter for brownies you're making, and the metal mixer is actually fraying or something along those lines or breaking apart, be sure you replace that as soon as possible. Also, like I said, with just the equipment and utensils, you want to be sure that it can be cleaned at all times. This is key in GMP. Now let's go over product contact surfaces. Just like the equipment and utensils, you want to make sure that it is a cleanable surface. And also you want to make sure it's corrosion resistant and made of non-toxic metals. You don't want a lead table to produce edibles on, but you know that. So now let's just go over some freezers and cold storage. So if you're going to use any freezers, cold storage, or anything like that to produce products, you just harvested some flower, you're going to put the flower in a freezer to plan on making some live resin, you want to be sure you have all the right methodologies and all the right, controls set in that freezer. For example, temperature monitoring, a constant log, and things along those lines. So instruments used for measuring, regulating, and recording temperatures, pH, acidity, water activity, and other conditions that control or prevent the growth of undesirable microorganisms in product must be accurate and precise. So here's what I always say, calibrate your equipment as often as possible. It's also going to be a win-win situation, because here's the thing. If your freezer temperature, goes above your temperature threshold, your live resin might not be as good at the end of the day. If your, pH sensors aren't calibrated in the cultivation room, your plants are going to have, deficiencies with certain nutrients because it might be out of the optimal level. Now, I want to talk about compressed air. So we actually have one of our sponsors here, TRI Air Testing. They do a lot in this. And here's the thing, if you're using any compressed air or other gases within the process, you want to make sure you're testing those lines. This is going to include everything from the extraction process, maybe when you're using your CO2, or I've even seen a few facilities where they have machines that automatically package and weigh their cannabis, and they use compressed air to move the product from one stage to another. So if you're using any compressed air or gases, be sure you test all of that, because the last thing you want is, say, a heavy metal to be in this line, you send off your extract to a lab, and then the lab says you failed because you didn't test one single thing.
I see.
Now we're going to go over processes and controls. So all operations must be conducted in accordance with adequate sanitation principles. So you want to be sure your facility is always, say, cleanable. You don't have any surfaces that would pose any risk to cross-contamination in your product. Also, appropriate quality control operations must be employed to ensure that the product is suitable for human consumption and that product packaging are safe and suitable. So I'm actually going to tie this back to the last presentation that was over supplier approval programs. One thing that I like to always refer to is the packaging that you're getting from your suppliers. You want to make sure that's safe. You don't want to just buy any packaging. You want to make sure that if my product touches this package, will my product still be safe? So definitely keep that in mind whenever you're looking at these things. And overall sanitation of the plant must be under supervision of one or more competent individuals. So you want to be sure that you have appropriately trained staff to be sure that you don't have any cross-contamination points, because keeping a clean facility will give you a clean product at the end of the day, which is really going to, say, relieve some of those headaches you may get if you don't have a clean product. So testing procedures must be used where necessary to identify sanitation failures or possible allergen cross-contamination. So whenever you do any cleaning of surfaces that you're using for product contact or food contact, what you want to do is you usually want to do a swab test of that, send it off to the lab, and be sure that, say, your cleaning methodologies are appropriate. If they're not, you do have a problem, and you should reevaluate either the sanitizer, maybe the duration that it's sitting on the surface, or so on. That's up to you. So raw materials and other ingredients must be inspected and segregated. So whenever you get a raw material, you shouldn't just put it on a shelf. You should look at it. You should make sure the condition is fine. And really, this should be on your receiving checklist once you get this in your safe facility. You want to be sure that it's safe for human consumption. So like I said with the packaging, you want to make sure you do a supplier approval program to vet out those suppliers that may provide unsafe products. So you also, if your product is held in bulk containers, it must be designed and constructed so it prevents against cross-contamination and, say, maybe allergen cross-contamination. So if you have these products, make sure that they are always sealed shut. And something else I like to say is the next bullet point as well. If you have this product in a receiving area or something along those lines, don't open the product and leave it open in the receiving area. Bring the product with you, bring it to the appropriate workbench or wherever you're working or process line, open the product and be sure it's sealed and stored in a safe manner. Lastly, if you are going to, say, dispose of any of this product, make sure that you properly dispose of it and it doesn't produce any contamination points. Now let's talk about allergens. This is particularly important with the edible section. Say if you have any nuts or any of the other common allergens in the United States, you want to be sure you have an allergy program with this. So segregate them and identify them. One thing that we typically recommend too is if you're looking at your storage plan and you have allergens, maybe try to put your allergens on a lower level of shelves, because if you have, say, eggs on your top shelf and egg breaks, egg falls on other products, technically you have allergen cross-contamination. So segregate those allergens and make them easily identifiable. Also, you want to make sure you have adequate measures to make sure you don't have any metals or any other, say, contamination points in your food, such as plastics. Some things I like to say to facilities to consider would be an X-ray or a metal detector. Kind of like the Hobart mixer example I had earlier. If you have a metal-on-metal mixer, you may have potential potential metal, say, contamination points, so it's not good. Now let's talk about steps such as trimming, cutting, sorting, and inspecting. So these must be performed so they are protecting against any cross contact or contamination. So if you have a trim room, make sure that all that product stays in the trim room. If you have biomass, make sure that goes through the proper channels. And just always be sure that these say products aren't touching each other in your workflow. Filling, assembling, packaging, and other operations must be performed in a way, like everything else, that protects against cross-contamination and allergen points. Now, here's one thing that people don't really consider in the cannabis industry right now as much as they should, and it's the testing of ice and finding out where this ice is coming from. A popular product right now is going to be rosin or live rosin. What that is you take the flower, you put it in ice, you stir it around, you get the trichomes off. Much more complex than that, but that's a basic overview of it. Now with that, if you are using ice as a processing aid or ingredient in this circumstance, and this ice isn't clean, you're not going to have a clean end product. So always be sure that your water supply is safe if you're going to use water in the process or if you're going to use ice. So warehousing and distribution. So storage and transportation of food and cannabis products must be under conditions that protect against allergen cross-contact and against biological, chemical, and physical contamination of the food, as well as deterioration of the food and the container. So be sure that you are storing this product in a manner that it is going to, say, hold up over time and it's not going to degrade. Now, we spoke about GMPs, and I want to just toss in a couple services that ASI actually has to offer. Here at ASI, we have 3 different divisions, which is the Auditing, Consulting, and Training Division. For cannabis clients under the Auditing Division, we have 4 services that are genuinely applicable. Number 1 is CGMP food processing, 2, CGMP dietary supplements, and then we have the CSQ services. So we have the CGMP, or CSQ CGMP, CSQ CGMP Plus, and then the CSQ CGAP and the CSQ CGAP Plus. So next is our consulting division. So say if you want to make one of these audits your goal, we can help you with every step of that process. Usually we have a 3-step approach, which is going to include a mock audit to do a baseline assessment, and then we'll help you with the development of any documentation you're lacking, and lastly, we can help you implement said documentation. And then the last division ASI has to offer is our training division. So if you have any staff that needs to be trained on HACCP, internal auditor, or maybe needs basic plant training, we got your back and we can certainly do that. So we are here to serve the cannabis industry, and so far there are 97 companies that are GMP certified. GMP certifications are a very hot topic in both the CBD and THC markets underneath cannabis. Companies are utilizing these audits to ensure that their product is safe and as a marketing advantage. Lastly, there are some other benefits with these CGMP audits. For example, if you are CGMP certified, you may get a discount on your insurance, which is oftentimes going to be more than the CGMP audit cost itself. So good stuff there. Now, if you'd like additional details, I highly recommend contacting ASI or going directly to our website, asifood.com.